settling in, jump into the comments and let me know where in the world you're listening from today. I love seeing how far our Shifter family reaches across the globe. As the story unfolds, don't be shy. I want to hear your thoughts. Tell me your favourite moments, your theories on the twists, or just drop a Team Beric or Team Rhea as we go. Your energy makes these stories so much more fun to share. Now, grab a cozy blanket, maybe a glass of something less potent than what Rhea had, and let's head back to the Ethelgard fortress.
Things are about to get very interesting.
Chapter 1. The Liquid Courage. The Unity Summit was supposed to be a celebration of peace between the various packs, but for someone like me, it felt more like an endurance test. As an Omega from a struggling territory, my presence here was purely functional. I was a background detail, a server in a room filled with the most powerful predators in the world. The music thrummed through the soles of my shoes, making my teeth ache with every heavy beat. Everyone around me was a hunter, their status etched into the way they stood and the way they looked down at anyone who didn't carry a title. To survive the night without falling apart under the weight of their judgment, I had found a bottle of Moonshade whiskey tucked away in a quiet corner of the buffet. I knew I should have exercised restraint, but after 3 generous glasses, the world felt much less terrifying. The fear that usually kept my shoulders hunched had evaporated, replaced by a warm, shimmering confidence that told me I was just as entitled to the night as any of the high-born wolves preening in the ballroom. The marble floors seemed to tilt ever so slightly as I made my way toward the terrace doors. I needed to escape the heavy sense of expensive perfume and competitive aggression that filled the indoor air. The royal gardens offered a sanctuary of cool moonlight and velvet shadows. The flowers here pulsed with a soft, natural light, casting silver glows across the gravel paths that wound through the estate. I wandered deeper into the labyrinth of hedges, my slippers making soft crunching sounds that seemed to echo in the stillness of the night. I felt lighter than I ever had, the whiskey turning my anxieties into distant, unimportant memories. It was in the furthest reaches of the garden, near a fountain carved from dark, ancient stone, that I saw him. He was standing perfectly still, looking out toward the jagged mountain peaks. Even from the back, his presence was overwhelming. He didn't look like the other lords. He looked like a force of nature that had been poured into a tailored suit. I should have turned around and walked back to the safety of the servants' quarters. My instincts, muffled as they were by the alcohol, should have screamed at me to run. Instead, I let out a soft laugh that caught his attention. He didn't turn immediately, but I could feel his focus shift to me, like a physical weight pressing against my skin. Most people would have trembled under that unseen pressure, but the liquid courage in my system made me bold. I walked right up to him, my steps a little less steady than I would have liked, but my head held high. When he finally turned to face me, I was struck by the sheer intensity of his features. His face was all sharp angles and hard lines, beautiful in a way that felt inherently dangerous. His eyes were a burning amber, glowing with an inner light that seemed to pierce right through my drunken bravado. He looked like he had never smiled a day in his life, his expression frozen in a brooding mask of cold indifference. "You know, you're really overdoing the whole dark and mysterious routine," I said, the words slipping out with a playful lilt I never would have used while sober. I actually reached out and poked his chest, my finger sinking slightly into the expensive fabric of his jacket. His heart was beating with a slow, powerful rhythm that I could feel even through the material. The scowl, the shadows, the way you're standing here all by yourself, it's a bit much. You're just a classic, cliché bad boy, aren't you? You think if you look mean enough, no one will notice you're just as bored as the rest of us. I tilted my head, grinning at him as if we were old friends sharing a private joke. I had no idea of his identity, but in that moment, he was just a handsome man who clearly needed to lighten up. The silence that followed my comment was heavy and cold. I watched as his amber eyes narrowed, the glow within them intensifying until they looked like molten metal. He didn't speak, and he didn't pull away from my touch. Instead, he moved with a speed that made my head spin. Before I could even blink, he had his hand tangled firmly in my hair, tilting my head back so I had no choice but to look up at him. His other arm slammed against the stone pillar behind me, pinning me into the small space between the cold rock and his massive heat. The scent of rain and cedar enveloped me, and for the first time that night, a shiver of genuine fear cut through my intoxication. He leaned in until his lips were hovering just inches from my ear, his body pressing firmly against mine until I could feel the strength of his frame. A low growl vibrated deep in his chest, a sound that felt like it was shaking my very bones. It wasn't the sound of a man. It was the sound of a king who had just been challenged by someone of no consequence. I could feel the raw power radiating off him, a shimmering aura of dominance that made my wolf whimper in the back of my mind. He was so much more than I had realized, a predator of such magnitude that the atmosphere seemed to hum with his displeasure. His grip on my hair was firm, a claim that let me know he was in complete control of the situation. He whispered against my skin, his voice a dark rasp that sent a jolt of electricity down my spine. "A bad boy?" he growled, the words dripping with a dangerous sort of amusement. He pulled me even closer, his chest rising and falling against mine as he took in my scent. I could see the darkness swirling in his eyes, a glimpse of the beast that lived just beneath the surface of his regal exterior. He looked at my mouth for a lingering second before his gaze snapped back to mine, pinning me in place with the sheer force of his will. "Little wolf, you have absolutely no idea what I am or how much trouble you've just walked into." The look in his eyes told me that the night was only just beginning, and my drunken mistake was about to change the course of my life forever. Chapter 2. The Hangover from Hell. The first thing I registered was the silence. It wasn't the bustling, chaotic silence of the servant quarters back home, nor was it the heavy, expectant silence of the summit ballroom. This was a deep, mountain silence that felt as though it had been carved out of the very rock itself. My head throbbed with a rhythmic intensity that matched the pulsing of my heart, a direct consequence of the moonshade whiskey that had seemed like such a good idea only hours before. When I forced my eyes open, the light pouring in from the massive floor-to-ceiling windows felt like a physical assault. I groaned, pulling a duvet that felt softer than a summer cloud over my face, trying to shield myself from the reality of the morning. The fabric was made of the finest silk, cool against my skin and smelling faintly of cedar and cold mountain rain. That scent triggered a flash of memory that made my blood turn to ice. I remembered a pair of molten amber eyes, a hard chest against my finger, and a growl that had vibrated through my very soul. I bolted upright, ignoring the way the room spun and the way my stomach lurched in protest. This was not my room. This wasn't even the modest guest house assigned to the lower-ranking visitors of the summit. The bed was a sprawling expanse of carved dark wood and silver inlay, large enough to accommodate an entire family of wolves. The walls were adorned with tapestries depicting ancient lunar cycles and great battles of the past. Everything in this space screamed of ancient wealth and absolute authority. I scrambled out of the bed, my feet sinking into a rug so plush it felt like walking on moss. My clothes from the night before were gone, replaced by a simple but elegant tunic made of soft linen.
The panic began to set in as I realized I had no idea how I had gotten here, or what had happened after the Alpha King had pinned me against that stone pillar in the garden. I stumbled toward the windows, hoping to see a familiar landscape, but the view that met me was breathtaking and terrifying all at once. I was high up, so high that the clouds seemed to drift just beneath the balcony railing. Jagged peaks of grey stone and white snow stretched out in every direction, a natural fortress that looked completely impenetrable. This was Ethelgard, the legendary mountain seat of the Midnight Throne. I was in the heart of the Alpha King's power, a place where very few Omegas were ever permitted to set foot. The memory of my voice, slurred and overconfident, calling the most dangerous man alive a bad boy, echoed in my mind, and I felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the whiskey. I had to get out. I had to find a way back to my pack before the king decided exactly how he wanted to punish me for my insolence. I rushed to the massive double doors of the chamber, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps. I grabbed the silver handles, praying they would turn, but as soon as I pulled, the doors remained stationary. I pulled again, harder this time, a whimper escaping my throat. From the other side, I heard the heavy clank of metal against metal. The doors swung inward, and I found myself staring at the broad chests of two elite warriors. They wore the dark steel armor of the king's personal guard, their expressions as cold and unmoving as the stone walls around us. They didn't move to attack, but they crossed their long spears in front of the doorway, creating a physical barrier that I knew I couldn't break. The reality of my situation finally settled over me, heavy and suffocating. I wasn't just a guest who had overstayed her welcome. I was a prisoner in a golden cage, and the man who held the key was the very same bad boy I had mocked in the moonlight. Chapter 3. The Golden Cage.
"I need to speak with whoever is in charge," I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to sound authoritative. The two guards didn't even blink, their eyes focused on the wall behind me. It was as if I weren't even a person to them, but merely a task they had been assigned to complete. The frustration began to bubble up beneath my fear, a small spark of the fire I had felt in the garden returning to my chest. "You can't just keep me here. I have a pack. I have responsibilities. My alpha will be looking for me." Even as I said the words, I knew they were hollow. My alpha was a man who would gladly trade 10 Omegas like me for a favorable trade agreement with the Midnight Throne. He wouldn't be looking for me. He would be looking for a way to apologize for my existence. "The king has decreed that you are to remain within these quarters for the time being." A new voice boomed from the hallway. The guards shifted slightly, making room for a man with a scarred face and a weary but sharp gaze. He wore the insignia of a commander, and his presence carried a weight that commanded immediate respect. He stepped into the room, his eyes scanning me with a mixture of curiosity and something that almost looked like pity. "I am Commander Bram. I suggest you make yourself comfortable, Rhea. The king is currently occupied with the closing ceremonies of the summit, but his orders regarding you were very specific. You are to be treated with the respect due to a guest of the crown, but you are not permitted to pass these doors without his personal escort." I stepped back, my hands curling into fists at my sides. A guest? Guests are allowed to leave. Guests don't wake up in locked rooms with guards at the door. Why am I here, Commander? If this is about what I said in the garden, I was intoxicated. I didn't know who he was. I'm happy to apologize, or leave a written statement, or do whatever is necessary to make amends. Just let me go home. The commander sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 years of service. He looked around the opulent room as if seeing it for the first time, then turned his gaze back to me. There was something in his expression that suggested he knew more than he was letting on, a secret that was hidden behind the professional mask of a soldier. The king does not care about your apologies, Rhea, Bram said quietly, his voice dropping to a level that the guards wouldn't easily overhear. He is a man of many moods, and you happen to catch him in one that no one has seen in a very long time. You called him a cliché. You poked him in the chest. You treated the alpha of alphas like a common troublemaker. In his world, that is either a sign of supreme madness or a sign of something far more significant. He is keeping you here because he wants to find out which one it is. For your sake, I hope it's the latter. He turned on his heel before I could find the words to respond, the doors slamming shut behind him with a finality that made my heart sink. I was trapped in a mountain fortress with a man who was fascinated by my defiance, and I realized with a jolt of terror that my disappearance was exactly what he had intended from the moment he whispered those words in my ear. Chapter 4. The Art of Invisibility. 3 days had passed since I was brought to Ethelgard, and I had quickly learned that the only way to survive the crushing weight of the fortress was to disappear within it. To my surprise, the guards had eventually relaxed their vigil over my room, allowing me to wander the hallways as long as I didn't attempt to approach the main gates or the lower mountain passes. I had spent every waking hour memorizing the layout of the castle, avoiding the main thoroughfares where the king and his advisors were likely to be found. I became a ghost in the halls of power, slipping through service tunnels and using narrow spiral staircases that were meant for the castle staff. My goal was simple. I would be so quiet, so unremarkable, and so difficult to find that King Beric would eventually lose interest in his new toy and send me back to the coast. I had developed a routine of waking up before dawn when the mountain air was at its sharpest and the castle was still draped in shadows. I would sneak down to the kitchens during the shift change, grabbing a loaf of crusty bread and some fruit before retreating back to the upper levels. I spent most of my time in the Great Library, a massive chamber filled with the smell of old parchment and beeswax. It was the one place where I felt a strange sense of peace, surrounded by the wisdom of generations of wolves who had come before me. The library was so vast that I could tuck myself into a corner on the third balcony and go an entire day without seeing another living soul. I read through dusty scrolls and ancient maps, searching for any mention of the Silver Site or the lost lineages of my people, though I told myself I was just looking for a way out. Despite my best efforts to remain unseen, I could feel the king's presence everywhere. The fortress was an extension of his will, and every stone seemed to pulse with his authority. I heard stories from the servants who passed me in the halls, whispers of his growing temper, of the way his amber eyes would glow even in the middle of the day, and of the strange, dark energy that seemed to be radiating from his chambers. They spoke of the feral shadow as if it were a living thing, a curse that had plagued the Midnight Throne for centuries. I tried to shut my ears to the gossip, telling myself that his problems were not my own, but my wolf would stir every time his name was mentioned. She didn't want to hide. She wanted to find him, to see if the bad boy she had challenged was truly as broken as the rumours suggested. On the fourth evening, my luck finally ran out. I had stayed in the library later than usual, lost in a book about the migratory patterns of the northern packs. The sun had long since dipped below the peaks, leaving the room illuminated only by the soft glow of the moon through the glass ceiling. I packed my things, moving silently toward the exit, when I heard the heavy, unmistakable sound of footsteps on the marble floor. They weren't the hurried steps of a servant or the rhythmic clanking of a guard. They were slow, deliberate, and carried a weight that made the very air in the room vibrate. I ducked behind a massive oak bookshelf, my heart hammering against my ribs so loudly I was sure he would hear it. The scent of rain and cedar filled the space, a primal warning that the master of the house had returned to his sanctuary, and I was exactly where I shouldn't be. Chapter 5. A Scent of Cedar and Rain. I pressed my back against the cold wood of the bookshelf, holding my breath until my lungs began to ache. The footsteps stopped just a few feet away from my hiding spot, and I could hear the faint rustle of fabric as he moved. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of his presence, a magnetic pull that seemed to draw all the heat out of the room. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that the shadows would be enough to keep me hidden, but I could feel his focus narrowing. He wasn't looking for a book, he was looking for me. The air didn't need to be thick for me to feel the raw power he was putting out, an alpha's command that made my knees weak and my wolf howl in a mixture of fear and longing. I realized then that my avoidance had been a complete failure. He had known exactly where I was every single second I had been in his home. "You've become quite the shadow, Rhea," he said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that seemed to echo through the empty library. "My guards told me you were exploring the service tunnels yesterday. You have a very creative mind for someone who claims to be so afraid of me." I didn't move, my heart racing so fast it felt like a trapped bird in my chest. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing me tremble, but the sheer gravity of his voice was hard to resist. He took another step, the sound of his boots against the floor sounding like a death knell in the quiet room. "I could have commanded you to appear at dinner every night. I could have had you brought to my study the moment you woke up. But I wanted to see how long you would try to run in a place with no exits." I realized there was no point in hiding any longer. I stepped out from behind the bookshelf, my chin tilted up in a desperate attempt to regain some of the bravado I had lost. Beric was standing by a large reading table, the moonlight from above catching the sharp angles of his face and making his amber eyes glow with a terrifying intensity. He wasn't wearing his crown or his formal robes. He was dressed in a simple black shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing the powerful cords of muscle in his forearms. He looked more like the bad boy I had mocked in the garden than ever before. But there was a darkness beneath his eyes that I hadn't noticed during the summit. He looked exhausted, haunted by a weight that no crown should ever place on a man's head. "I wasn't running," I lied, my voice sounding far steadier than I felt. "I was just enjoying the library. It's the only place in this mountain that doesn't feel like a prison." He let out a short, dark laugh, a sound that carried no real merity. He moved closer, and I instinctively took a step back, my heels hitting the edge of the bookshelf. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of me, his height casting a long shadow over my smaller frame. The heat coming off him was staggering, a living force that seemed to pull at my very soul. He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from my cheek, and I felt a jolt of electricity leap between us. "You think this is a prison?" he whispered, his eyes dropping to my mouth for a fraction of a second. "Little wolf, the real prison is the one I've been living in for years, and you are the only thing that has managed to rattle the bars." Chapter 6. The Midnight Scavenger. I waited until the grandfather clock in the hallway struck 2, its heavy bronze chime echoing through the silent corridors like a warning I was determined to ignore. My stomach had been growling for hours, a persistent reminder that skipping dinner to avoid the Great Hall had come with a physical price. I slipped out of my room, my bare feet silent on the cold stone floors. The fortress at night was a different creature entirely, the shadows stretching and yawning in the dim light of the flickering wall sconces. I navigated the back staircases with the ease of someone who had spent the last few days memorizing every crack in the masonry. My goal was the main kitchen, a place I knew would be deserted at this hour, offering me the chance to scavenge enough supplies to last through another day of hiding. When I reached the heavy oak doors of the kitchen, I paused, pressing my ear to the wood. Hearing nothing but the crackle of a dying fire in the hearth, I pushed the door open just wide enough to slip inside. The room was vast, filled with the lingering smells of roasted meats and savoury herbs. I moved toward the pantry, my eyes scanning the shelves for anything portable. I managed to find a small loaf of crusty bread and a wedge of hard cheese, wrapping them in a linen cloth I found on the counter. Just as I was about to reach for a stray apple, a low, smooth voice drifted through the darkness, stopping my heart mid-beat. "The bread is better with the blackberry preserved in the third jar on the left," the voice said. I spun around so quickly I nearly knocked over a tray of silver spoons. King Beric was sitting at a long wooden preparation table in the centre of the room, his form partially obscured by the shadows. He wasn't wearing his royal regalia. Instead, he was dressed in a simple dark tunic that was unbuttoned at the throat, looking less like a monarch and more like a restless spirit. A single candle flickered between us, casting long, dancing shadows across the sharp planes of his face. He looked at me with an expression that was dangerously close to amusement, his amber eyes tracking my every movement. I stood frozen, clutching my stolen bread to my chest like a shield. "I didn't realize anyone else would be awake," I managed to say, my voice sounding thin in the cavernous room. I wanted to run, to bolt through the door and disappear back into the safety of the upper levels, but my legs felt as though they had been turned to lead. Beric didn't move to stop me. He simply sat there, watching me with a predatory stillness that made the hair on my arms stand up. The bad boy energy I had mocked was radiating off him in waves, a raw, untamed power that seemed to hum in the very floorboards beneath my feet. "Sleep is a luxury I haven't enjoyed in a very long time," he replied, his voice a velvet rasp that made a shiver of awareness race down my spine. He stood up, his movements fluid and graceful, and began to walk toward me. I backed away until my shoulders hit the cold stone of the pantry wall, trapped between the shelves and the most powerful man in the kingdom. He stopped just inches away, the heat from his body reaching out to wrap around me like a physical weight. He reached out, not for me, but for the apple I had been eyeing, his fingers brushing against mine for a fleeting, electric second. He took a slow, deliberate bite of the fruit, his gaze never leaving my face. "You spend so much time running, Rhea. It must be exhausting." I swallowed hard, my wolf pacing restlessly in the back of my mind, confused by the strange mixture of fear and attraction pulling at my soul. He was so close I could see the dark ring of gold around his pupils and the slight tremor in his hand that he was clearly trying to hide. Before I could find my voice to retort, he leaned in, his breath warm against my ear as he whispered a final thought. "Don't bother hiding tomorrow. I've decided that if you want to be a ghost, you're going to be mine." Chapter 7. The Decree of Service. The following morning did not bring the quiet sanctuary I had hoped for. I was jolted awake, not by the sun, but by a rhythmic, insistent pounding on my chamber door that felt like it was vibrating through my very skull. I scrambled out of bed, barely having time to pull on my tunic before the doors were thrown open. Commander Bram stood there, his expression a mask of professional neutrality that didn't quite hide the glint of pity in his eyes. He held a scroll sealed with the royal crest, the dark wax looking like a drop of dried blood against the parchment. Without a word, he handed it to me, his stance rigid as he waited for me to process the contents. I broke the seal with trembling fingers, my eyes skimming the elegant, sharp script. It wasn't an execution order, nor was it a release form. It was a formal decree of service. By order of King Beric, I was being appointed as the Royal Archivist's personal assistant, specifically assigned to the king's private study. The message was clear. My days of hiding in the service tunnels and sneaking through the library were over. He was pulling me directly into his line of sight, placing me in a position where I would be forced to spend hours every day in his presence. The forced proximity was no longer a side effect of my imprisonment. It was a deliberate strategy. "He can't be serious," I muttered, looking up at Bram, who merely offered a sharp nod. "I don't know anything about archiving. I was a server. I don't belong in the king's study." Bram didn't move, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword in a way that reminded me he was a soldier first and a messenger second. He gestured toward the hallway, indicating that my refusal was not an option. I realized then that Beric had played me. He had watched me struggle to stay invisible and had decided to make it impossible for me to ever disappear again. He wanted me where he could see me, where he could study me as if I were one of the ancient relics he kept behind glass. I followed Bram through the winding corridors of the fortress, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. We climbed higher and higher into the mountain, passing through doors guarded by elite warriors who didn't even acknowledge our passage. The air grew cooler and thinner as we reached the royal wing, the atmosphere heavy with the weight of centuries of power. Finally, we stopped before a pair of massive ebony doors, carved with the image of a wolf howling at a crescent moon. Bram stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. I took a deep breath, trying to summon whatever remained of the courage I had found in the whiskey, and pushed the doors open. The study was a sprawling room, filled with the scent of old paper and wood smoke. Towering shelves lined the walls, packed with thousands of leather-bound volumes that looked as though they hadn't been touched in decades. In the center of the room sat a massive desk of dark wood, and behind it, framed by a window that looked out over the sheer drop of the mountain, was Beric. He didn't look up as I entered, his focus entirely on the document he was signing. The silence in the room was suffocating, a physical pressure that made me want to scream just to break the tension. He finally set the pen down, his amber eyes lifting to meet mine with a look of predatory satisfaction. "Welcome to your new position, Rhea. I suggest you start with the scrolls on the far left. They've been waiting for someone with your unique perspective." Chapter 8. The King's Amusement. The first few hours in the King's study were an exercise in psychological warfare. I sat at a small, cramped table in the corner, surrounded by piles of crumbling parchment that smelled of dust and forgotten history. My task was to categorize and summarize tax records from a century ago, a job so tedious it felt like a deliberate punishment. Every time I looked up, I found Beric watching me. He wasn't even pretending to work half the time. He would simply lean back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin, observing me with a disturbing intensity. He was waiting for me to break, for the silence to drive me into another outburst that he could pick apart with that sharp, analytical mind of his. "You're very quiet today," he remarked, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. I didn't look up from the scroll I was untangling, though my fingers were shaking so much I could barely read the faded ink. I refused to give him the satisfaction of knowing how much his presence was rattling me. The memory of the garden kept playing on a loop in my mind, the way his hand had felt in my hair, the heat of his body, and the terrifying promise in his growl. Now, in the harsh light of day, he looked even more formidable, a man who could crush my entire life with a single word. "I'm working, Your Majesty," I replied, my tone as flat and professional as I could make it. "I assumed that was why I was brought here." Beric let out a soft, dark chuckle that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He stood up and began to pace the length of the room, his movements slow and deliberate. He stopped near my table, looking down at the messy pile of papers I was trying to organize. He reached out and picked up one of the scrolls, his fingers brushing against mine as he took it. The contact sent a jolt of heat through my arm, a sharp reminder of the bond that seemed to be pulling us together despite my resistance.
"You called me a cliché," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register that made my heart skip a beat. "You said I was a classic bad boy." I've been thinking about that. Most people are too terrified to even look me in the eye, let alone insult my character. Tell me, Ria, do you still think I'm just an act? Do you still think this is all for show? He leaned down, his face just inches from mine, and I could see the raw, jagged edges of his pain reflected in the amber of his eyes. The bad boy facade was there, but beneath it was something much older and much more dangerous. I finally looked up, meeting his gaze with a defiance I didn't know I still possessed. "I think you're a man who uses fear because he doesn't know how to handle anything else. I think you keep people at a distance so they can't see how much you're struggling." The words were out before I could stop them, a flash of my seer instinct breaking through my fear. Beric's expression shifted, the amusement vanishing to be replaced by a look of genuine shock. For a second, the mask slipped entirely, and I saw the hollow, haunted man behind the king. He didn't growl, and he didn't pull away. He simply stared at me, his breath hitching as he struggled to regain his composure. "You have a dangerous tongue, little wolf," he whispered, his voice trembling with a suppressed emotion I couldn't identify. He turned away abruptly, walking back to his desk with a stiff, formal gait that spoke of a man trying to hold himself together. The tension in the room had shifted from predatory to something much more vulnerable, and I realized that I had touched a nerve I hadn't even known existed. I went back to my scrolls, but the silence was no longer heavy with his amusement. It was filled with the echoing sound of a secret that had finally been dragged into the light. Chapter 9. The First Crack. Days blurred into a repetitive cycle of dusty scrolls and silent observations. Beric and I existed in a state of armed neutrality, the air between us charged with the lingering tension of our last encounter. He didn't tease me anymore, and I didn't offer any more unwanted insights into his character. We worked in a silence that was almost peaceful, save for the occasional sound of a turning page or the scratching of a quill. Yet the more time I spent in his presence, the more I noticed the small details he tried so hard to hide. I saw the way his jaw would clench when the sun began to set, the way his eyes would scan the shadows of the room as if expecting an attack, and most notably, the persistent tremor in his right hand. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, while a heavy fog was rolling in off the mountain peaks, shrouding the fortress in a grey, ghostly light. Beric was attempting to sign a decree when his hand suddenly seized, the quill skittering across the parchment and leaving a jagged blot of ink in its wake. He hissed through his teeth, a sound of pure, unadulterated frustration, and slammed his fist against the desk. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet study. I looked up, my breath catching in my throat as I saw him slumped in his chair, his head bowed and his shoulders shaking. He looked fragile, a word I never thought I would associate with the Alpha King. Without thinking, I stood up and moved toward the small sideboard where a pitcher of water sat. My wolf was pushing me forward, her instincts overriding my common sense. I poured a glass and walked over to his desk, my steps cautious, as if I were approaching a wounded animal. I set the glass down near his shaking hand, the water rippling gently in the light. Beric didn't move for a long moment, his breathing ragged and uneven. I could feel the darkness radiating off him, a cold, heavy energy that made the room feel as though it was sinking into the earth. It was the curse, the feral shadow, and it was clearly winning the battle for his soul. "Drink," I said softly, my voice devoid of the sharp edge I usually kept for him. "It won't fix everything, but it might help." Beric slowly lifted his head, his eyes so dark they were almost black. The amber glow was gone,
replaced by a void of such profound sadness that it made my heart ache. He looked at the glass and then up at me, his expression a mixture of confusion and a raw, naked vulnerability that made me want to reach out and pull him into my arms. He reached for the glass, his fingers brushing against mine as he took it. This time, the spark wasn't one of heat or aggression. It was a soft, grounding warmth that seemed to steady his hand. He drank the water in silence, his throat working as he swallowed. When he finished, he set the glass down with a shaking hand, his gaze still fixed on me. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice a mere shadow of its usual power. "I am the man who took you from your home. I am the man you called a monster. Why show me any kindness?" I didn't have an answer that made sense, not even to myself. I just knew that I couldn't sit by and watch him drown in his own shadows. I saw the man behind the king, the bad boy, who was really just a boy who had been forced to carry a burden far too heavy for any one person. "Because no one should have to be alone in the dark, Beric," I replied, using his name for the first time without the shield of his title. The air in the room seemed to shift, the cold energy of the curse receding just a fraction. He reached out, his hand finally steady, and tucked a stray lock of hair behind my ear. The touch was so light, so tender, that it nearly broke me. We stood there for a heartbeat, two lost souls finding a momentary sanctuary in the middle of a storm, until a sudden, violent crash of thunder shook the entire fortress. The sky outside turned a bruised, angry purple, and I felt a surge of ancient, malevolent power rising from the depths of the mountain.
Chapter 10. The Feral Shadow. The storm that broke over Ethelgard was unlike anything I had ever witnessed on the coast. It wasn't just rain and wind. It was a physical manifestation of the mountain's fury. Lightning arced across the sky in jagged, violet veins, illuminating the study in brief, terrifying bursts of light. With every peal of thunder, the dark energy I had felt earlier intensified, swirling around Beric like a living shroud. He stood up abruptly, his eyes snapping back to that hollow, lightless black. He didn't look at me as he shoved past the desk, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. I watched in horror as his shadow seemed to detach itself from the floor, lengthening and twisting into a monstrous shape that mirrored his every move. "Get out, Rhea," he growled, the sound no longer coming from his throat, but seemingly from the very air around him. "Go to your room and lock the door. Do not come out, no matter what you hear." He didn't wait for a response, stumbling toward the private door that led to his inner sanctum. I could hear the sound of furniture being overturned and the shattering of glass as he moved. The feral shadow was taking over, the curse reaching its peak as the moon climbed behind the storm clouds. I stood frozen in the middle of the study, the bread and scrolls forgotten, my entire being vibrating with a terrifying, magnetic pull toward the source of the darkness. I tried to obey him. I really did. I made it as far as the hallway, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. But as I reached the main staircase, a sound echoed through the stone corridors that stopped me in my tracks. It wasn't a growl or a roar. It was a cry of pure, agonizing pain, a sound so lonely it made my soul weep. My seer blood, dormant for so long, suddenly surged through my veins like liquid silver. I could see the lines of power connecting me to him, glowing threads of light that were being stretched to the breaking point. My wolf wasn't afraid of the shadow. She was mourning for the man trapped inside it. I turned back, my feet moving of their own accord toward the king's private chambers. The guards who usually stood watch were gone, likely retreated to a safe distance to avoid the king's lunar madness.
The ebony doors to his bedroom were slightly ajar, a sliver of violet light spilling out into the darkened hallway. I pushed the door open, the atmosphere inside so heavy it felt like walking through water. The room was a wreck. Tapestries torn from the walls, the massive bed overturned, and glass shards littering the floor like diamonds. In the centre of the chaos was Beric, kneeling on the floor, his body racking with violent tremors. He was half transformed, his hands tipped with sharp black claws, and his skin glowing with a sickly, iridescent light. The shadow behind him had grown into a towering entity of smoke and malice, its claws raking across his back as it tried to tear its way out of his body. I stepped into the room, my silver sight flaring to life, allowing me to see the curse for what it truly was, a parasite of dark magic feeding on his life force. I didn't think about the danger or the fact that he could kill me with a single swipe of his hand. I only knew that I was the only person who could hear the man screaming inside the monster. I walked toward him, my hand outstretched, as the shadow turned its eyeless gaze toward me and let out a bone-chilling shriek. Chapter 11. The Quietest Room. The shadow entity shrieked, a sound that didn't vibrate in the air so much as it clawed at the very center of my brain. It was a cacophony of lost souls and ancient malice, a freezing wind that threatened to extinguish the silver light glowing beneath my skin. Beric's body jerked as the smoke-like claws of the curse dug deeper into his shoulders, pulling a guttural sound of agony from his throat that broke my heart. Every instinct I possessed as a wolf screamed at me to flee, to hide in the deepest crevice of the mountain until the sun returned. But my blood was singing a different song. It was a melody of resonance and ancient duty, a rhythmic pulse that told me I was exactly where I was meant to be. I took another step forward, my bare feet navigating the jagged shards of glass that littered the floor. The darkness tried to push me back, a physical pressure that felt like walking into a gale, but the silver glow in my veins intensified, carving a path through the gloom. I reached the center of the room and sank to my knees beside him. Beric's transformation was a horrific sight. His skin was stretched tight over shifting bone, and his eyes were swallowed by that terrifying, empty void. He looked up at me, but I knew he couldn't see me through the haze of the feral shadow. He was lost in a nightmare of his own making, a king drowning in a sea of ancestral trauma. I didn't hesitate. I reached out and placed my hands firmly on his cheeks, my palms resting against the burning heat of his skin. The moment our flesh met, a shockwave of energy rippled through the room. The shadow entity recoiled, let out a final frustrated hiss, and began to dissolve back into the floorboards. Beric's entire frame went rigid before he collapsed forward, his head landing heavily on my shoulder. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside this circle of two, the world had gone perfectly still. I held him there, my arms wrapping around his trembling form as his breathing began to slow and settle. The iridescent light on his skin faded, replaced by the natural warmth of a man who had finally found a moment of peace. I could feel the steady beat of his heart against mine, a frantic rhythm that gradually synchronized with my own. My silver sight stayed active, showing me the dark stains of the curse receding into the corners of his soul, held at bay by the simple proximity of my touch. I was his anchor, the only thing keeping him from drifting away into the permanent madness of his lineage. We stayed like that for hours, two figures huddled amidst the ruins of a royal chamber. I didn't care about the danger anymore, nor did I care about the secrets he was hiding. All that mattered was the weight of him in my arms, and the way his fingers curled into the fabric of my tunic, as if he were afraid I would vanish if he let go. He was the most powerful man in the world, a king who could command armies and shatter mountains. Yet in the quietest room in Ethelgard, he was just a soul seeking shelter. As the first grey light of dawn began to creep through the shattered windows, Beric finally stirred. He didn't pull away immediately. Instead, he rested his forehead against mine, his amber eyes fluttering open. They were clear now, the molten gold back in full force, but they were filled with a profound, aching vulnerability that made me catch my breath. He looked at me as if I were a miracle he didn't deserve, and I realized with a jolt of terror that the slow burn of my feelings had finally reached a flashpoint. Chapter 12. The Library's Secret. The morning after the storm felt like waking up in a different world. Beric had been whisked away by Commander Bram and a team of healers as soon as the sun broke over the peaks, leaving me alone in the wreckage of his suite. I had been escorted back to my room, but sleep was impossible. My mind was a whirlwind of questions and silver light memories. I waited until the fortress was fully awake before making my way back to the great library. I didn't go to my usual corner. Instead, I headed for the restricted archives in the basement, a place I had noticed during my midnight wanderings, but had been too afraid to enter. The door was heavy iron, but to my surprise, it swung open at my touch, as if the castle itself were inviting me to discover its hidden truths. The basement was cool and smelled of damp stone and ancient ink. I moved through the aisles of iron-bound chests until I found a section dedicated to the genealogy of the Midnight Throne. My fingers traced the spines of heavy, dusty tomes until I found one that felt warm to the touch. It was bound in white leather and lacked a title. As I opened it, the pages began to glow with a faint, silvery luminescence. I began to read, and the pieces of the puzzle finally started to click into place. The book spoke of the Lost Seers, a bloodline of Omegas who were the natural counterparts to the Midnight Kings. Our blood wasn't just a mark of rank, it was a biological antidote to the feral shadow. We were designed to be the balance to their chaos, the light that could lead them back from the edge of the abyss. As I turned the pages, I saw illustrations of rituals that made my skin crawl. The seers weren't just mates, they were often treated as living sacrifices, their life force drained to keep the kings sane. The lineage hadn't died out by accident. It had been hunted and hidden away to prevent the kings from ever being truly cured. The High Council preferred a king who was burdened and unstable, a man who was easier to manipulate. If a seer was found, she was to be brought to the fortress and bound to the throne, her power used as a battery for the Alpha's instability. I felt a cold chill settle in my marrow as I realized that Beric hadn't kept me here because of a drunken insult. He had sensed what I was from the moment I touched him in the garden. I wasn't a guest or even a prisoner. I was a resource. I closed the book, the heavy thud echoing in the hollow silence of the basement. I wanted to be angry, to feel betrayed by the man who had looked at me with such raw need only hours before. But as I thought of his shaking hands and the way he had collapsed into me, the anger wouldn't come. I saw a man who was fighting a war on two fronts. One against the darkness in his blood, and another against the snakes in his own court. I was a tool to the council, but to Beric, I was something else entirely. I stood up, determined to find him and demand the truth, but as I turned to leave, a shadow blocked the doorway. It wasn't Beric, and it wasn't the commander. It was a woman, dressed in flowing robes of deep violet, her eyes sharp and calculating. She looked at the book in my hand, and then at me, a cruel smile spreading across her face that told me my secrets were no longer my own. Chapter 13. The Masked Gala. The woman was High Priestess Morana, and within an hour of our meeting in the archives, She had orchestrated a transformation that left me feeling like a stranger to myself. The High Council had declared a grand gala to celebrate the stability of the kingdom, and I was to be the centerpiece of the evening. I was bathed in oils, my hair woven with silver threads, and dressed in a gown of midnight blue that seemed to shimmer like the night sky. The fabric was so fine, it felt like a second skin, clinging to my curves in a way that made me feel exposed despite the elegant cut. I was no longer the server from a coastal pack. I was being presented as a lady of the court, a move intended to quiet the rumours of the king's madness by showing a picture of royal harmony. The gala was held in the Great Hall, a room of staggering proportions, illuminated by thousands of candles. The atmosphere was a sharp contrast to the summit. Here, the air was filled with the scents of expensive wine and old money, a polished veneer of civility covering the jagged teeth of the elite. As I walked down the grand staircase, every eye in the room turned toward me. I could hear the whispers, the sharp intake of breath as the lords and ladies tried to place me. I felt like a lamb being led into a den of wolves, my heart hammering against the silk of my bodice. I scanned the room for a familiar face, finally finding Beric standing at the base of the stairs. He was dressed in formal military attire, his chest adorned with medals and his crown resting heavily on his brow. The moment our eyes met, the rest of the room faded into a blur. He didn't look like a king in that moment. He looked like a man who was seeing something he couldn't quite believe was real. He stepped forward, extending his hand to me as I reached the bottom step. His touch was like a brand, a jolt of heat that travelled straight to my core and settled there. The bad boy from the garden was gone, replaced by a regal, imposing figure that commanded the attention of every soul in the hall. But as he leaned in to greet me, I saw a flicker of that same vulnerability in his amber eyes. He leaned down, his lips brushing against my knuckles in a gesture that was far more intimate than protocol required. "You look stunning, Rhea," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that made my knees weak. "But you look like you want to bolt for the nearest exit." I tried to maintain my composure, aware of the hundreds of eyes watching our every move. The forced proximity of the dance floor was approaching, a requirement of the evening that I was both dreading and craving. I wanted to ask him about the book, about the seers, and about the way he had held me in the storm, but this was a theatre, and we both had roles to play. He led me toward the centre of the hall as the orchestra began a slow, haunting waltz. As he pulled me into his arms, the physical tension between us became an almost tangible force, a slow burn that threatened to consume us both before the first note had even finished. Chapter 14. A Dance with Danger. The music was a flowing, melancholic melody that seemed to pull at the very fibres of my soul. Beric's hand was firm on the small of my back, guiding me through the intricate steps of the waltz with a grace that felt entirely too natural. We moved as one, our bodies perfectly synchronized in a way that defied our short acquaintance. I could feel the eyes of the High Council on us, a heavy weight of judgment and expectation, but I forced myself to focus only on the man holding me. The scent of rain and cedar was overwhelming, a primal anchor that kept me grounded even as my head spun from the sheer intensity of the moment. We were surrounded by the elite of the kingdom, yet it felt as though we were the only two people in existence. "They think they've won," Beric said softly, his voice barely audible over the music. "The council thinks that by putting you in this dress and forcing this dance, they can control what happens between us. They see you as a solution to a problem they don't want to solve." I looked up at him, meeting his amber gaze with a boldness that seemed to surprise him. The bad boy mask was firmly in place for the crowd, but his eyes were wide open to me. I could see the shadows of the curse still lingering at the edges of his pupils, a constant reminder of the stakes we were playing for. I realized then that every move he made was a calculated risk, a desperate attempt to protect me from the very people who claimed to serve him. "And what do you see, Beric?" I asked, my voice steady despite the flutter in my chest. "Do you see a solution, or do you see a person?" He stopped for a fraction of a second, the rhythm of the dance momentarily broken, before he smoothed it over with a practiced step. He pulled me closer, until there was no space left between us, his heart beating a frantic rhythm against my own. The air between us was electric, a slow-burning heat that made it hard to breathe. He looked down at me, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a flash of the man who had been kneeling on the floor of his chamber, broken and hurting. He looked like he wanted to say 1,000 things, but the walls of the fortress were filled with ears. "I see the only person who hasn't tried to break me," he whispered, his grip on my hand tightening. "I see a woman who mocked a king, and then saved his soul without even knowing why." He spun me around, the skirts of my gown flaring out like a dark cloud, and for a moment, the world was nothing but light and motion. But as the dance reached its crescendo, I saw Marana standing near the edge of the floor, her gaze fixed on us with a cold, predatory intensity. She wasn't watching the dance. She was watching the way the silver light was beginning to pulse beneath my skin, reacting to Beric's proximity. The realization hit me with the force of a blow. The gala wasn't a celebration. It was a test, and I was failing to hide exactly what I was from the people who wanted to use me most. Chapter 15. The Jealousy of High Priestess Marana. As the music faded and the applause of the court filled the hall, Beric was pulled away by a group of insistent generals, leaving me standing alone at the edge of the dance floor. I felt a sudden sharp chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. I turned to find Marana standing directly behind me, a glass of dark wine in her hand and a look of pure, unadulterated venom in her eyes. She leaned in, her presence feeling like a physical stain on the beauty of the evening. She didn't bother with the pleasantries of the court. She went straight for the jugular, her voice a sharp hiss that cut through the noise of the party. "You think you're special, don't you?" she sneered, her gaze raking over my gown with obvious disdain. "You think because he looks at you with a bit of hunger, you found a place in this house. But you are nothing but a tool, Rhea, a battery to keep his madness at bay, so the rest of us can continue to run this kingdom. He doesn't love you. He needs you, and there is a very dangerous difference between the two." I felt the blood drain from my face, her words echoing the fears I had tried to bury in the library. She stepped closer, her scent a cloying, heavy floral that made my stomach churn. She was a woman who had spent her entire life vying for the power that now seemed to be resting in my hands, and she wasn't going to let it go without a fight. "The seers were never queens," Marana continued, her voice dripping with malice. "They were property. They were kept in the dark and used until there was nothing left of them but empty shells. Do you really think Beric is any different from the alphas who came before him? He is a predator, and you are the only thing standing between him and a feral end. He will drain you, little wolf, and when you are finally spent, he will discard you for the next shiny thing that can quiet his mind." I wanted to shout, to tell her she was wrong, but the memory of the rituals in the book was too fresh in my mind. I looked across the room and saw Beric laughing at something a general had said, his face a perfect mask of royal indifference. Was he really just using me? Was the heat I felt between us just a biological reaction to a cure? The insecurity flared in my chest, a dark flame that threatened to swallow the progress I had made. I couldn't stay here, not with Marana's words poisoning the air and the weight of the crown pressing down on me from across the room. I turned and fled the great hall, ignoring the confused looks of the guests as I pushed through the heavy doors. I ran through the corridors, the silver threads in my hair coming loose and the silk of my gown snagging on the rough stone walls. I didn't stop until I reached the outer balcony, the cold mountain air hitting me like a slap. I looked out over the jagged peaks, the darkness of the world feeling more like a home than the glittering lights of the gala. I had to get away. I had to leave this mountain before I lost myself entirely to a man who might only see me as a way to stay sane. I began to climb the stone railing, my heart set on the shadows of the forest below, unaware that someone was watching me from the darkness. Chapter 16. The Escape Attempt. The cold was the first thing that greeted me, a sharp, biting wind that sliced through the thin silk of my gala gown, as if the fabric were nothing more than a spiderweb. I had climbed over the stone railing of the balcony, my fingers stinging as they gripped the rough, frozen masonry. Below me, the mountain dropped away into a jagged abyss of shadows and moonlight, a terrifying descent that promised only pain for the clumsy. But the voice of Marana was still ringing in my ears, poisoning my thoughts with the idea that I was nothing more than a biological remedy for a feral king. I couldn't stay. I refused to be a battery for someone's sanity, a tool to be used and discarded once the darkness had been sated. I found a narrow ledge and began the slow, agonizing crawl down the side of the fortress, my fancy slippers offering no grip against the treacherous ice. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest as I lowered myself into the dark. My wolf was pacing frantically in the back of my mind, her instincts divided between the urge to run and the desperate need to return to the scent of cedar and rain. She knew Beric was the alpha, the mate she had been searching for in the dark, but my human pride was a much harder thing to satisfy. I reached the lower terrace and bolted toward the tree line, my heavy skirts snagging on the brambles and tearing with a sound like a dying animal. I didn't care about the dress or the jewellery. I only cared about the distance I was putting between myself and the golden cage of Ethelgard. The forest was deep and ancient, the trees towering over me like silent sentinels, watching my frantic flight through the undergrowth. The deeper I ran, the more the mountain seemed to close in on me. The ground was uneven, covered in slippery moss and hidden roots that sent me sprawling into the dirt more than once. My breath came in ragged, burning gasps, and the silver threads in my hair were long gone, replaced by twigs and dried leaves. I stopped to listen, my ears straining for the sound of pursuit, but all I heard was the haunting howl of the wind through the peaks. I was alone, a low-ranking Omega lost in the wilderness of the High Alphas, and for the first time, the reality of my situation began to sink in. I had no food, no warmth, and no way to defend myself against the predators that called these woods home. The courage the whiskey had given me so many nights ago was a distant memory, replaced by the cold, hard truth of my vulnerability. I pushed forward, driven by a stubborn refusal to be property, until the sound of a snap behind me made me freeze. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't a falling branch. It was a heavy, deliberate step. I turned, my heart hammering against my ribs, and saw the glimmer of amber eyes through the trees. My wolf let out a submissive whimper, a sound I had never heard from her before. The shadow that emerged from the brush was massive, a silhouette of pure power that made the very earth seem to tremble. It wasn't the king in his royal robes, it was the hunter, the man who had warned me that I had no idea what he truly was. I backed away, my heel catching on a root, and fell backward into the cold, damp earth as the figure stepped into the moonlight. Chapter 17. The Hunter's Mercy. Beric stood over me, his chest heaving as if he had run the entire way from the fortress without stopping. He wasn't wearing his crown, and his military jacket was unbuttoned, revealing the raw intensity of the man beneath the title. He didn't look angry, which was almost worse. He looked devastated, his amber eyes searching my face with a desperate, searching longing that made my throat tighten. He didn't reach for me or growl an order for me to return. He simply stood there in the silence of the forest, the moonlight catching the silver light that was still pulsing faintly beneath my skin.
The bad boy energy was there, but it was tempered by a profound, aching vulnerability that stripped away all my defenses. "Why?" he asked, his voice a low, broken rasp that seemed to vibrate in the marrow of my bones. "After everything, after the way the darkness quieted when you touched me, why would you run into the winter like this? You could have frozen to death, Rhea. You could have been taken by the wild packs that don't recognize the law of the throne." I looked up at him, my eyes stinging with tears I refused to let fall. The memory of Mirana's words flared up, a bitter shield against the softness in his voice. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the way my legs shook, and put a few more feet of distance between us. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him I knew about the seers and the way my blood was being used, but the words felt like lead in my mouth. "I'm not a tool, Beric," I finally shouted, the sound echoing through the trees. "I'm not a battery for your curse or a solution to your council's problems. I saw the books. I know what the seers were to the kings. You didn't keep me here because I insulted you. You kept me here because you needed a cure, and I was the only thing you could find." Beric winced as if I had struck him, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He took a step toward me, but stopped when he saw me flinch. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of the truths we had both been hiding. He looked down at his hands, the tremor I had seen in the study returning with a vengeance. "You're right," he whispered, his gaze finally lifting back to mine. "I did sense what you were that night in the garden. For the first time in my life, the noise in my head stopped because you were near me. I was selfish, Rhea. I was a man drowning, and you were the only piece of wood I could find to stay afloat. But if you think that's the only reason I've spent every night watching your door, or every day trying to find ways to make you smile, then you're the one who has no idea." He moved with that blurring speed I had seen before, but this time he didn't pin me to a wall. He pulled me into his arms, his face burying in the crook of my neck as he held me with a strength that felt like a sanctuary rather than a prison. I struggled for a moment, but the scent of cedar and rain overwhelmed me, and my wolf finally surrendered, leaning into the heat of his body as he lifted me into his arms to carry me back to the fortress. Chapter 18. The Vulnerability of Kings. The walk back to the fortress was a blur of motion and heat. Beric didn't say another word, his focus entirely on navigating the steep terrain while keeping me shielded from the wind. By the time we reached his private chambers, my body was numb from the cold, and my mind was a fractured mess of conflicting emotions. He set me down gently on the rug before the fireplace, immediately kneeling to stoke the embers into a roaring blaze. He didn't call for the servants or the healers. He fetched a heavy fur blanket himself and wrapped it around my shoulders, his hands lingering on my arms for a moment longer than necessary. The room was still a mess from the storm, a reminder of the beast that lived inside him. But right now, he was just a man trying to keep me warm. "I won't apologize for needing you," he said quietly, sitting on the floor across from me, his back against the base of his bed. "But I will apologize for letting you think that your power was all I saw. The seers were treated like property because the men who ruled before me were cowards who feared their own shadows. They didn't want mates, they wanted anchors. But I've spent my entire life being an anchor for a kingdom that hates me, and I don't want a tool, Rhea. I want someone who looks at the king and sees a bad boy who needs to get his act together." He let out a soft, self-deprecating laugh that made my heart skip a beat. The vulnerability in his expression was so raw, it was almost hard to look at. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, the warmth of the fire finally beginning to thaw the ice in my veins. I looked at him, really looked at him.
and saw the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes. He was a king who had never been allowed to be a person, a man who had been told since birth that his only value was his strength and his ability to contain the madness of his blood. I realized then that we were both prisoners of the same system, just in different types of cages. My seer blood was a burden, but his alpha blood was a death sentence. The slow burn of the last few weeks finally flared into something undeniable, a magnetic pull that had nothing to do with rituals or ancient books. The book said the bond has to be a choice, I whispered, my voice finally finding its strength. It said that if the seer doesn't give her light freely, the curse will eventually consume them both. Is that why you didn't just force the ritual? Beric looked at me, his amber eyes swirling with a mixture of heat and sorrow. He reached out, his fingers grazing the back of my hand, and I didn't pull away. The contact was electric, a spark of silver and gold that seemed to illuminate the space between us. I would rather go feral and lose my mind than force you to be something you aren't, he said, his voice dropping to that deep, vibrating register. Just as I was about to reach for him, a sudden, sharp pain lanced through my skull, and a vision of Marana standing over a broken crown flashed before my eyes, cold and terrifying. Chapter 19. Whispers of Mutiny. The vision hit me like a physical blow, sending me reeling back against the stone hearth. I could see the great hall, but it wasn't filled with dancers and music. It was filled with shadows and the metallic scent of blood. Marana was there, her face twisted in a look of triumphant malice as she held a silver dagger over a kneeling figure I recognized all too well. Beside her stood several of the high alphas from the council, their eyes glowing with a treacherous, hungry light. They weren't trying to cure the king. They were waiting for the great eclipse to strike, a time when the alpha's power would be at its weakest, to strip him of his title and turn him into a mindless weapon for their own ends. The feral shadow wasn't just a curse, they were actively feeding it with dark magic to accelerate his decline. "Rhea! What is it? What do you see?" Beric was on his feet in an instant, his hands gripping my shoulders to keep me upright. My eyes were wide, the silver light within them glowing so brightly it was casting shadows against the walls. I grabbed his forearms, my nails digging into his skin as the images continued to pour into my mind. I saw the hidden passages beneath the fortress, the ones I had explored, being used by rebel soldiers to bypass the main guards. I saw the high priestess chanting over a bowl of black liquid, a ritual designed to sever the king's connection to his pack and leave him vulnerable to the shadow. It wasn't just a plot, it was an execution, and it was scheduled to happen during the final peak of the eclipse. "It's Marana!" I gasped, the words tumbling out of my mouth in a frantic rush. "She's not trying to help you. She's leading them, Beric. The council. They've been feeding the curse. They want you to go feral. They want a king they can leash like a dog, and they're going to use the eclipse to do it. They're already in the tunnels. They're coming for you, and they're going to use my blood to bind you to their will." The colour drained from Beric's face, but his grip on me didn't slacken. The bad boy mask was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating focus of a general. He didn't question my vision. He had seen enough of my power to know that the seer in me was never wrong. He pulled me to my feet, his gaze snapping to the ebony doors. "We have to move. If they've already breached the lower levels, the guards might already be compromised." He grabbed a heavy sword from the wall, the silver blade gleaming in the firelight. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, from intimate to lethal. He looked at me, his eyes burning with a protective fury that made my wolf howl in approval. I told you that you had no idea what I was. Tonight, you're going to see it. But I need you to stay behind me, Rhea. No matter what happens, you cannot let Marana touch you." The fortress groaned as a heavy boom echoed from deep within the mountain, the sound of the gates being forced. The mutiny had begun, and the darkness was finally at our door. Chapter 20. The Choice. The air in the hallway was cold and smelled of damp earth as we moved toward the hidden staircases. Beric led the way, his movements silent and predatory, his sword a lethal extension of his arm. Every few seconds a low growl would rumble in his chest, a warning to the shadows that danced along the walls. I followed close behind, my seer instincts flaring with every step, showing me the paths that were safe and the ones that were already teeming with Marana's men. We reached the entrance to the royal vaults, a place where the ancient magic of the Midnight Throne was strongest, but Beric stopped, his hand going to his head as he let out a sharp hiss of pain. The eclipse was beginning, and the moon was starting to slip behind the sun, pulling at the curse inside him like a physical tide. "I can feel it," he whispered, his breathing becoming ragged as he leaned against the cold stone wall. "The shadow, it's pushing. It knows the time is coming." He looked at me, his amber eyes flickering with the black void of the feral shadow. He was losing his grip, his strength being drained by the celestial event and the dark magic Marana was channeling from below. We were out of time. If we didn't break the curse now, he would be lost before the rebels even reached us, and I would be left to face Marana alone. The choice I had been running from since the summit was finally standing right in front of me, stripped of all its complexity. It wasn't about the council, the kingdom, or the ancient books. It was about the man who had carried me through the snow. "The ritual," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around us. "Beric, we have to do it now. If I bind my soul to yours, the light will be inside you. They won't be able to use the shadow to control you if it's gone." He looked at me, a flash of horror crossing his features. "No, you don't know what that means, Rhea. It's a permanent bond. You'll be tied to my madness, to my life, to every burden I carry. You'll never be able to leave." I stepped toward him, taking his face in my hands just as I had during the storm. I didn't see a king or a curse. I saw my mate, the other half of my soul that I had been too afraid to claim. "I'm not running anymore," I whispered, pulling his head down until our foreheads touched. "I choose this. I choose you, Beric, not because I'm a tool, but because I'm yours." The silver light in my veins surged, responding to my words with a warmth that filled the entire corridor. Beric let out a choked sound, his arms wrapping around me as he finally let go of the control he had been clinging to. The air around us began to shimmer with a mixture of gold and silver light, the beginning of a soul binding that had not been seen in 1,000 years. But as our lips were about to meet to seal the vow, the heavy iron doors at the end of the hall shattered inward, and Marana stepped through the smoke, her eyes burning with a dark, vengeful light. Chapter 21. The Siege of Ethelgard. The heavy iron doors didn't just open, they disintegrated under the force of Marana's malice, sending shards of metal and stone skittering across the floor like lethal hail. Through the rising dust and the acme of the eclipse's chilling shadow, the High Priestess stepped forward. She was flanked by a dozen warriors whose eyes were glazed over with a milky, unnatural film, their movements mechanical and devoid of any human grace. These were the Grey Cloaks, the council's private executioners, and they were here to ensure that the king's feral descent was permanent. The atmosphere in the hallway felt dense with the weight of ancient, forbidden magic that tasted like copper and old blood on the back of my tongue. I could feel Beric's strength flagging beside me, his fingers digging into my shoulders as he struggled to maintain his footing. The darkness within him was responding to the external pressure, a black tide rising to meet the call of the eclipsed moon. Marana's smile was a jagged thing, filled with a cold triumph that made my skin crawl with 1,000 invisible needles. She held a staff of gnarled wood, topped with a pulsing, violet crystal that seemed to drink in the remaining daylight. "You were always too sentimental, Beric," she sneered, her voice echoing with a strange, double-toned resonance. "You think a low-ranking girl with a drop of ancient blood can stop the inevitability of your line's decay? The Midnight Throne was built on power and sacrifice, not the delusions of an Omega server. Tonight, you become the weapon you were always meant to be, and she will be the fuel that keeps you burning." She raised her staff, and the grey cloaks lunged forward, their blades singing a high-pitched, discordant note as they sliced through the gloom. I didn't have time to be afraid. The silver light in my veins reacted to the threat with a violent, protective surge that pushed me to the front. I stood between Beric and the approaching soldiers, my hands outstretched as the seer magic began to manifest as a shimmering, translucent barrier of light. The first warrior struck the shield, his blade shattering into 1,000 pieces upon impact. The force of the blow travelled through my arms, vibrating in my chest, but I didn't yield. I could feel the lines of the mountain's energy flowing through the soles of my feet, feeding into the light. Behind me, I heard the sound of Beric's sword leaving its sheath, a sharp, metallic ring that promised a different kind of justice. Even weakened by the eclipse, he was a predator of the highest order, and he wasn't going down without a fight. Beric moved with a lethal, desperate grace, his body a blur of motion as he intercepted the soldiers who tried to bypass my shield. Every swing of his blade was a testament to his will, a king defending his soulmate with the last of his fading power. The hallway became a chaotic blur of steel and silver light, the sounds of combat muffled by the heavy, unnatural silence of the eclipse. I focused all my intent on Beric, sending pulses of my own life force into his back to keep the feral shadow at bay. I could feel his pain, the way the curse was clawing at the edges of his mind, and I knew we were losing the battle of attrition. Marana began to chant, a low, guttural sound that made the very stones of the fortress groan in protest, and I realized with a jolt of terror that she wasn't just attacking us. She was pulling the mountain itself down upon our heads to force the ritual to its bloody conclusion. Chapter 22. The Eclipse Ritual. The sun was nearly gone now, leaving only a thin, haunting ring of light in the sky that cast the world into a bruised, purple twilight. The pressure in the hallway reached a breaking point as Marana's chant hit a fever pitch, the violet crystal on her staff glowing with a blinding, malevolent brilliance. The grey cloaks had been pushed back by Beric's relentless defence, but the cost was etched into the pale lines of his face and the way his breath came in jagged, bloody gasps. He fell to one knee, the sword clattering to the floor, as the black smoke of the feral shadow began to pour from his eyes and mouth. The curse had found its opening, and it was tearing him apart from the inside. I dropped to my knees beside him, my silver light flickering like a candle in a hurricane, and I knew that if I didn't act now, there would be nothing left of the man I loved to save. "Beric, look at me!" I screamed over the roar of the mountain's shifting stone. I grabbed his face, forcing him to meet my gaze even as the void tried to swallow the amber light in his eyes. The contact burned, a searing heat that travelled up my arms and into my heart, but I didn't let go. I began to channel everything I was, every memory of the garden, every moment of the library's quiet, and every spark of the slow burn attraction that had defined our time together into the bond. I wasn't just offering him my blood, I was offering him my soul. I could feel the ancient magic of the seers recognizing the claim, a rhythmic, deep thrumming that started in the center of my being and expanded until it filled the entire corridor with a brilliant, blinding white light. The world seemed to dissolve into a sea of pure energy as I pushed my mind into his. I found myself in a landscape of jagged black glass and eternal storms, the heart of Beric's internal prison. The feral shadow was there, a towering beast of smoke and rage, but I didn't shrink away. I walked toward it, my silver sight showing me the man trapped at the center of the darkness. I reached out and took his hand, and the moment our fingers interlaced, the ritual was complete. I felt the snap of the bond as it locked into place, a permanent, unbreakable tether that linked our fates across time and space. The light from my soul flooded into the void, a tidal wave of purity that washed away the black rot of the curse and replaced it with a calm, steady brilliance. Outside the mental landscape, a shockwave of silver and gold erupted from our bodies, throwing Mirana and her soldiers back against the walls with the force of a physical explosion. The violet crystal on her staff shattered into dust, its dark power extinguished by the purity of the true mate bond. The eclipse reached its peak, the world going completely dark for a single, breathless heartbeat. But within the hallway, we were glowing with the intensity of 1,000 stars. I felt the curse break, the heavy chains of the feral shadow dissolving into nothingness. Beric let out a long, ragged breath, his body finally relaxing as the iridescent light of the transformation faded into a healthy, vibrant glow. He looked at me, and for the first time since the summit, his eyes were clear, untainted by the madness of his blood, just as a final, desperate scream from Mirana heralded the collapse of the ceiling above us. Chapter 23. The King Unbound. Dust and debris rained down from the fractured ceiling, but not a single stone touched us. A shimmering dome of gold and silver light had formed over Beric and me, a physical manifestation of the bond that now unified our power. I looked up and saw the High Priestess struggling to stand, her robes tattered and her face a mask of disbelief and fury. The grey cloaks lay scattered on the floor, their unnatural life force snuffed out by the breaking of the crystal. The eclipse began to recede, the first sliver of the sun's return cutting through the darkness like a promise of a new era. Beric stood up, his movements no longer jerky or pained, but filled with a terrifying, absolute authority that made even me tremble. He wasn't the bad boy king anymore. He was a sovereign who had been forged in fire and tempered by love. He stepped out from under the protective dome, his gaze fixed on Mirana with a cold, lethal focus.
The atmosphere seemed to bow to his will, the shadows retreating into the corners as he walked toward the woman who had tried to destroy him. "You spoke of power and sacrifice, Mirana," Beric said, his voice a deep, vibrating bass that resonated through the very foundations of Ethelgard. "But you forgot the most ancient law of our kind. A king is only as strong as the mate who stands beside him. You tried to use my blood as a weapon, but you only succeeded in revealing the depth of your own treachery." He didn't even reach for his sword. He simply raised his hand, and a wave of raw alpha energy slammed into Mirana, pinning her against the wall with the force of a mountain's weight. The high alphas who had been hiding in the shadows of the tunnels began to emerge, their hands raised in surrender as they saw the transformation of their king. They had expected a mindless beast to command,
but they were faced with a man whose power was now bolstered by the light of a seer. The rebellion crumbled in an instant, the fear of the unbound king far greater than their ambition. Beric turned back to me, the lethal edge of his expression softening into a look of such profound devotion that it brought tears to my eyes. He reached out and pulled me into his arms, his heart beating a steady, powerful rhythm against my chest. The fortress was still in ruins, and there was much work to be done to root out the rest of the traitors. But for the first time in centuries, the Midnight Throne was secure. "It's over, Rhea," he whispered, his breath hot against my ear as he held me close. "The shadow is gone. I can think, I can feel, and it's all because of you." I leaned into his warmth, the exhaustion of the ritual finally beginning to take its toll. The silver light in my veins settled into a gentle, comforting hum, a constant reminder of the man who was now a part of me. We had survived the eclipse, the mutiny, and the curse, but the greatest challenge was still ahead of us. We had to build a kingdom where a low-ranking Omega could stand as a queen, and where a bad boy king could finally find the peace he had been denied for so long. I looked out through the shattered doorway at the rising sun, knowing that while the night had been long, the dawn belonged to us. Chapter 24. More Than a Bad Boy. The coronation was held 3 months later, not in the stuffy, aggressive atmosphere of the Great Hall, but in the royal gardens where our story had truly begun. The bioluminescent flowers were in full bloom, casting a soft, romantic glow over the assembled lords and ladies of every pack in the territory. The air was crisp and fresh, smelling of wet earth and the new growth of spring. I stood at the top of the marble stairs, my gown a masterpiece of silver silk and white fur that made me look like a creature of the moon itself. The silver sight was no longer a secret or a burden. It was the jewel of the crown, a power that I used to ensure justice and harmony throughout the realm. As I walked down the aisle toward the obsidian fountain, the crowd went silent, a mark of respect that had been earned through blood and sacrifice. Beric was waiting for me at the altar, looking every bit the sovereign he had become. He wore the traditional dark robes of the Midnight Throne, but he had discarded the heavy, restrictive crown of his ancestors for a simple silver band that matched my own. The look in his amber eyes as I approached was enough to make my heart stop. It was a mixture of pride, desire, and a love so deep it felt like it could span lifetimes. He took my hands in his, the warmth of the bond pulsing between us like a physical heartbeat. We weren't just a king and a queen, we were a single entity, two halves of a whole that had finally found their way home. The High Priestess was gone, the council had been reformed, and the kingdom was finally breathing again. "Do you remember the first night we were here?" Beric asked softly, his voice a low vibration that only I could hear. "In the garden at the summit, when you were so bold and so beautifully reckless." I laughed, the sound bright and clear in the evening air. "I remember a very brooding man who looked like he needed a serious reality check. I believe I called you a cliché." Beric chuckled, a deep, rich sound that made my wolf purr with contentment. He pulled me closer, his forehead resting against mine as the officiant began the final words of the ceremony. The transition from server to sovereign had been a journey of terror and transformation, but I wouldn't have traded a single second of fear if it meant losing the man holding me now. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to twinkle in the vast mountain sky, Beric leaned in for the kiss that would seal our union before the eyes of the world. It wasn't a